Today, in this lecture, we will try to deal with how historiography emerged in the so-called Islamic world. And we normally, for convenience, we call it Islamic historiography, meaning thereby that some trends started in that great, very large tract of land which comprises Arab world and as well as Persia. What we find is that Islamic history, what are the influences? Right in the beginning, I told you, these are the places where historiography took very long time to emerge. So it was influenced considerably by Byzantine historiography. Arabs, before the advent of Islam, had alphabets in Yemen, Kufic script, possessed literate communities spread all over Arabia, and possessed their own literature as well, though largely nomadic in nature and very elementary. About 100 years after the death of Prophet, Ibn Ishaq compiled the sayings of the Prophet, and after about 200 years, Ibn Hisham wrote his first biography. The questions that therefore arise are, why did they feel a need to do so? That is the question. Why it was? And how did they do it? What were their sources and the nature of their critical apparatus? What took so late for such a development to occur in comparison to other civilizations or other countries? The Prophet was born in 570 AD at Mecca in Hijaz. Mecca was a very important trading center at that time. It was strategically located on the Yemen-Mocha Arabian Sea trade and was therefore on the lifeline to trade with India. The Arabs spread over the entire peninsula, were for the most part nomads. This does not, however, mean that they did not carry on any trading activities. Their trading interest occasionally accumulated them together at Mecca. Around 610 AD, the Prophet made public his revelations, and around 624 AD, he was forced to leave Mecca and migrated to Yasrib, that is Medina, which then became his stronghold. Having Medina as a stronghold, the new converts could interfere in the Syrian-Mecca trading connections, and this may have been one reason, besides obviously proselytization, for the acceptance of Islam by the Meccans. By 632, that being the death of Prophet's death, the entire peninsula had become under the Islamic fold. Under the caliphs, Islam spread outwards. Byzantine, which included Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, was taken, and later Iran was also captured, which already had a separate, independent cultural identity. In the tussle for Khilafat, the foundations of the power of Abu Muawiyah rested on the Byzantine part, while that of Ali rested on the Iranian part. With the success of Muawiyah, the foundations of the Umayyad dynasty were laid. Under the Umayyad, it seems there was almost no development in Arabic literature or history. We come across hardly anything of any significance coming under the Umayyad period. Umayyads were replaced by the Abbasids, 672 AD, who shifted their capital from Damascus to Baghdad. Much of what we know today of the Islamic culture is the contribution of, in a way, Abbasids. All major historical works of Islamic culture that we know today, from Ibn Ishaq to Tabari and Baladhuri, are essential contributions of the Abbasid dynasty. Arab historiography begins very late. Right from the time of the collection of Quran by the third Caliph, 644 AD, to 760s, rather well into the 8th century AD. There is almost no history surviving. Ibn Ishaq's biography, surviving only in parts, is a development that occurs very late. Why did Arab historiography develop so late then? That's the question. One explanation could lay in the arrival of the Greek influence. Margoliouth, refutes this explanation and argues against the presence of any Greek influence on Arab historiography. He denies that and suggests indigenous developments to be responsible for its development. His first basis of argument is that while Greek work dealing with philosophy, geometry, medicine, and astronomy were translated into Arabic in dozens, there is not one Greek work of history that merited the attention of the Arabs. This is obviously not to say that historical works were not known to the Arabs or were not referred to, but none of them was thought worth translating. Otherwise, they could have translated them. He then goes on to expound the internal development that might have led to the development of Arab historiography. He says that in the absence of a strong written tradition among the Arabs of the peninsula, the Quran initially was not considered necessary to be recorded. It was, however, later realized that it might, as perhaps it did, get changed in the course of oral transmissions. Third Caliph therefore ordered it to be written down, and thus Quran was placed in a rigid form, in a format and content both. The Quran was thus first large written book in Arab history, though obviously the tradition of oral transmissions continued. Thus, as the need for preserving the religious traditions became more pressing, traditions of oral transmissions were weakened and were gradually replaced by written records. In addition, it is also asserted, among others by Margoliouth, that since the Umayyad claims to power rested on belonging to the house of Quraysh, while that of their opponents rested on belonging to the house of the Prophet, the former looked with suspicion towards all efforts that ought to look too closely in the Prophet's life and that of his family. Religious traditions were thus deliberately suppressed and history writing was discouraged. It is a testimony, it is asserted, to the ruthless suppression of the Umayyads that no written account worth the name comes to us from the Umayyad period. This judgment perhaps is too harsh on Umayyads. The reason why there is no literature coming from Umayyad period laying the backwardness and nomadism of the language during that time. It was only by the time of the Abbasids that the language began to show signs of maturity and versatility. Even until the end of the century, Arabic could not even develop as an official language of the conquered territories. It was Abdul Malik who replaced Syriac by Arabic as the official language. Later, people more civilized than the Arabs began to write in Arabic, and it were these Mawalis who, by using the developed techniques, styles, and even vocabulary of their cultures, gave Arabic an unprecedented quality, versatility, and erudition. Ibn Ishaq, the first compiler of Prophet's traditions, was a non-Arabic, and so was Ibn Hisham. These Mawalis, unlike the Arabs, had the idea of a book. So the first written traditions were in the nature of what the Europeans called monographs. That is, collecting together traditions of one type or the theme. The question naturally arises as to how did these writers establish the credibility of these traditions. Their credibility was sought to be established by a system of asnad, identification of the source, though through a certain chain of narrators. The first kind of writing which developed this procedure were the siras, not only important in their own right, but also because of their judicial importance, which began to be attached to them in Islamic law. Gradually, the procedure of the Asnad was extended from the religious traditions to Tarikh. Tarikh is history, Arabic term for history. Al-Madini wrote several monographs on secular themes, on women, on particular kinds of men, and on conquest, etc. The extension from Madini to Tabari is a great leap forward. Now I'm going to discuss Al-Tabari. Great leap forward. From mere collection and compilation of traditions on particular themes to a style of writing wherein there is a chronological arrangement of the subject Critical reasoning is there, and a developing concept of universal history. It seems very unlikely that any indigenous development could have fostered this leap forward. One can clearly see Greek influences appearing in Tabri's work. They were also trying to write a universal history. The argument that since no Greek work on history was translated into Arabic, there were no significant influence of Greek historiography on the Arabs, thus, appears extremely erroneous and ill-founded. It fails to notice that while Greek works on philosophy and science were universally important and influential, being as much important for the Arabs as for the Greeks, their works on history, situated as they are deeply in the context of their own regions, would appear pretty uninteresting and useless for the Arabs. They could see no apparent wars or Thucydides that is description of the wars between Sparta and Athens. It obviously does not mean that they were unaware of the Greek way of history writing. The Syrians writing in Arabic were as much well versed in Arabic as in Greek language. So, the Greek influence thus reached the Islamic civilization mainly through the Syriac and Byzantine literature. The brief biography is given by Yakut and in some other source books of later times. He was born sometimes around 838 AD and died sometime around 922 AD. He was a Persian Tabaristan. His early education was in his own province, but he took his higher education at several other places. Here I would like to point out, the name of the place where he was born. It may sound very Indian of modern days, not of early days. And the place is called Amul in Persia. So his early education was in his own province, but he took his higher education at several other places. He was fond of traveling and visited Syria, Egypt, Iraq, Peninsular Arabia, almost all important places of the Islamic civilization except North Africa and Spain. His account was written with two major purposes. What was his purpose for writing? Every historian has a purpose to write, objective. One is to attempt a universal history of mankind. Second is to provide tafsir or commentary on the Quran with the motive of providing a context to the revelations of the Quran on the basis of the Hadith literature and historical evidence relating to the judgments and decisions of the early caliphs. To provide tafsir or commentary on Quran with the motive of providing a context to the revelations of the Quran on the basis of Hadith literature and historical evidence relating to the judgments and decisions of the early caliphs. These are important. Fortunately, Tabriz Tariq survives. Complete, It is a universal history of the prophets and rulers until the Hijrat of the Prophet, that is 622 AD. Whereafter, it becomes the history of the Prophet and his successors. It thereafter ceases to become world history but becomes an Arab history based on not just the Quran and the Sunnah, the sayings of Prophet, doings of Prophet, but also the Jewish and Christian traditions of Old Testament. We find evidence of that. Though obviously he had no direct access to these traditions, but received them as traditions commonly among the learned Muslims. He also seems to have used Arab and Persian chroniclers and traditions, Bastan Namak, Hurda Namak, and others, which no longer survive. Somehow they don't survive now. Tabri's concept of universal history is very interesting because it extends from the Jewish prophets and those referred to in the Quran to include the histories of Persia and to some extent of the Byzantine Empire. The real value of his work begins after 622 AD, after Prophet has migrated, whereafter it becomes a specific history of the Arabs. The account thereafter is arranged in a chronological order from year to year. Since the arrangement is chronological, Tabri was forced to assign dates for events of which their dates were not known to him. While the chapters are arranged chronologically, within the chapter the arrangement is accordingly, according to the theme and not according to sequence. Yet the chronological arrangement prevents him to discuss a phenomenon in cohesion when it is spread over a number of years. The narrative is broken with each chapter, as in the case of conquest of Central Asia. For the same reason, he also fails to develop an argument or interpretation. He is very careful about his sources. When he states an oral tradition, he is very meticulous about the following the Asul Isnad, and even when he refers to written evidence, he takes care to state the Isnad of the author. On what basis that particular author is saying one particular thing. He was writing at a time when all sorts of traditions were circulating. To his credit, he did not collect the narrative of one party alone. His accounts have, for instance, the conflicting versions of the Iraqites and the Syrians, or of the pro-Umayyads and the anti-Umayyads. While recording these conflicting traditions, he refrains from passing his own judgment but prefers to let his narratives speak. He must, however, have exercised some kind of selection, very obvious, which, however judicious, would be impressed by some of his unconscious biases. Tabri's history, therefore, sets a tradition of impartiality. He has no heroes, no villains. Another major, this gentleman Simakian. Another major contribution of Tabri is his wide scope of history. His history is not just accounts of prophets and rulers, but has important sections on the various tribes, administrative events, taxation, administrative measures, agreements, and treaties, and on the various sections of the subjugated peoples. Julius Wellhausen, in his famous book, History of the Arabs, he has also written this history of Al-Tabari, a historical work largely based on Tabari, succeeds in identifying the partisans of different political forces and their viewpoints by sifting the various versions available in Tabari, and also succeeds largely owing to the availability of Tabari's account in providing regional context to these conflicts and in highlighting the tensions and contradictions present in Arab society, the then Arab society. He has also keenly able to corroborate Tabri's information from other sources and has found him, Tabri largely reliable and highly reliable. In fact, even where he has cast doubts on Tabri's veracity, as on his description of Kharaj and Jazia, other later writers like Dennett and Lockegard, who wrote Islamic taxation in the classical period, they have found Tabri to be correct. Tabri's impact on subsequent Islamic historiography was immense. He established the trend of impartial historiography by putting the accounts of all sides in the narration. He also brought to the technique of isnad or authority criticism from the realm of religion to the realm of history. Tabri, by insisting on the authenticity of his sources, established the tradition of testing the narrators, not the narration. By putting forth the accounts of all sides, he also enabled the modern historians to direct the Islamic society, bring out the conflicts in its polity and dissensions in its structure. Another major trend established by Tabri was an attempt at writing universal history. Tabri was among the first to introduce the concept of universal history, a history of mankind, which UNESCO has published in the 1990s. From the first man known to the contemporary society as Adam up to his own times, his concept of history may be narrow. It indeed is largely political, but quite significantly is universal. That credit should go to him. These characteristics of Tabari also signify his limitations. His entire critical apparatus is restricted to the narrators, to checking the authenticity and verifying their isnad, but fails to critically examine the narrations of the narrators. In other words, his emphasis is on the narrators, not narration. As if once the credibility of a particular narrator is accepted, everything that he says has to be accepted uncritically, which is unhistorical. History has to be critical and insofar as its sources are concerned, but not as far as historical events are concerned. Nowhere in his account do we find a critical appreciation of historical developments, a dispassionate analysis of social forces, or even a logical scrutiny of stated facts. Another major drawback in his account is that it is largely political, as I said earlier also, when the description of the Prophet and caliphs force him to take the religious aspect into account, his insistence on chronological arrangement is an added restraint in preventing him from taking the cultural and social history into account. This is our suggestion. Tabari had immense influence as on Islamic historiography. Yet he was followed by historians who could clearly discern the limitations of his historiography and suggested a different style of writing history. In this respect, the contributions of two scholars would emerge before us, who would immediately come to our mind. They are one Al-Masudi and second is the Al-Beruni. Al-Masudi, a near contemporary of Tabari, was basically a geographer who combined geography with history. His geographical concerns allowed him to give each region a distinct entity, and when sets down to combine the history with geography, each region assumes a historical personality. In writing the history of different regions, Masudi is thus writing a regional history, or rather a history with a specific territorial connotation. He also seeks to emphasize the influence of geography on history, in the sense that geography, he thought that geography shapes very largely the historical personality of a region or of people living in that region. Then next is Al-Beruni, circa 1035 AD, when he wrote that book Kitabul Hind, is the first sociological writing to have writer to have social considered to be the sociological writing, because it has been undertaken in the Islamic civilization. He takes an alien culture as his subject of study and very objectively analyzes its major characteristics. Significantly, he drops isnad, nor is there that kind of critical scrutiny of sources that characterize Tabari. On the other hand, he takes almost the entire literature of the Indians as the sources of his study of the contemporary and earlier Indian dynasties and civilizations. So he is both a historical and his is a both a historical and sociological effort. His outlook is that of a scientist and is not on that of a theologian. In attempting a comparative study of the Islamic civilization and India, he very passionately notes the prevalence of common superstitions, common religious beliefs, and even common social values. Since all these major writings were in Arabic language, they were to have tremendous influence in the intellectual milieu of the entire Islamic civilization. It did not matter if Al-Beruni wrote in the Punjab and Idris wrote in Sicily.